Welcome back to this Vue, Vuetify and Firebase project. In the last video we made sure that only authenticated users can reach, this page here, this create a meetup page. Now I want to work on something on this page which isn't working in the way it should work. The upload. We only can paste the image URL thus far, and that's nice, but it would be nicer if we could pick one of our files and upload that file to the server. So this is what we're going to work on in this video. We'll add an upload button here and we'll make sure that we can upload a picked file to Firebase. So let's get started implementing this upload functionality. And it starts in the create meetup.vue file in the template here, where we have our image URL text field. Now, as I just mentioned in the intro, I don't want to enter a download URL into a text field anymore. So we can basically get rid of that. Instead, what we need is an input of type file. Now, if we change it like this and don't do anything else, it'll look like this. And that's not super pretty. Now, it turns out that Vuetify, at least of the point of time I'm recording this, doesn't have a component for this file upload. So if we check out the inputs there, we only got text fields. We got no file input. And if that changes, feel free to use that. Until then, I'll use a nice workaround though, a button which will trigger this file upload window opening. So what I'll do is, I'll add another element here next to this input field. And this field I'll add here is a vButton element. So this button here should be a raised button, let's say, and I'll give it a label of upload image. Now if we save this and we go back, we see this upload image button here. Now obviously we can give it a class of primary to style it according to our primary style to make it red. But the key thing is we now have this button here. Now if I click this button, I want to trigger this input so that I can hide this input because it's ugly. So as a first step, I'll hide the input here by assigning a style and setting the display to none. If I do that, it's still in the DOM, we can still work with it, but of course we don't see it, we can't click it directly. That's why I have this button. I'll add my click listener to this button and I'll say on click, I want to pick a file. So let's maybe execute a method called onPickFile. It doesn't exist yet, I'll add it in a second. So that's the file, or that's the method I want to execute. And in this method, I obviously want to target this input here and simulate a click on it because it's hidden, but I still want to interact with it. Now Vue.js gives us a nice feature, so-called references. We can assign a reference to any element in our DOM, in our template here. We do this by adding the ref attribute or directive to it. So this is the directive we add, ref. And now here we can assign any key we want, like for example, file input. Again, this string here is totally up to you though. So with that assigned, we can create this onPickFile method by scrolling down to our methods. And here, I'll simply add it as a new method here. And I want to trigger a click on this file input, on this hidden file input. So what I'll do is I will simply say this, and now $refs gives us access to all the references in this template of this component. So we can access our reference here by simply saying .file input, because that's the name we assigned. And all I want to do is I want to execute a click there with click. This is using this native DOM element click method we can execute to simulate a user click on it. With that, this file input will now do its default behavior, which is open a file picker. And if we feel like it, we can even go up to this file input. Where is it? Here. And set the accept attribute here to image star to accept any image but nothing else. We could also, of course, say image PNG to limit it to PNGs only. So this is the picker setup. Now let's see if it works. If we save this, we get an error. Which error do we get here? Yeah, I've been working too much with TypeScript. I'm adding semicolons again. we don't use semicolons in the style we use here, right? So back to our template. If I now click this button, we see this file picker open up and we can pick a file here. Now, if I click open, we don't see it here, but it was indeed stored in this file input. So that's one important step. We're already closer to uploading this. The next step is to make sure that whenever the attached file, so the file attached to this input here, does change, that we actually get notice of that. Now for that, I'll first of all structure this over multiple lines to make it easier to read, but then I'll add a listener to the change event, which is fired whenever the attached file changes. I'll simply execute a method called onFilePicked. So let's add this method here at the bottom, onFilePicked. Here I'll get this default event passed into this method. So the default DOM event is automatically passed into this method. We don't have to do that explicitly. And now we can retrieve the file from this event. So on this event, which is fired upon changing the file input, we actually can easily retrieve all the attached files by accessing event target, which refers to that file input, and then files. Now that's a list of files. However, we only will have one because it's not a multi-select input or anything like that. So we can only select one file here in our application. Therefore, we can retrieve the file by accessing the first element in this files array. I'm more interested in the file name though for now. So I'll create a new variable named file name where I will access files. Then the first element is a set because we only have one element here in this array and it's the first one. And then we can access file name on this file. That's a property provided by JavaScript, by native vanilla JavaScript. So now we get the file name. As a next step, I want to make sure that we actually do have a valid file with an extension basically. So I can check if file name last index of dot, if that is smaller or equal than a 0, which means it doesn't have a dot in the file name, which means it doesn't have an extension. And even though that could theoretically be a valid image, I don't want to upload that. So here I will return an alert where I say, please add a valid file. And of course, feel free to fine tune this to your needs and be more helpful with your error message or whatever you like. So we got a file and it's valid, at least with our basic validation here. Next, I want to turn this file into a base64 string, basically. So you could say I want to turn this binary file into a string value, which I can then later use to upload it. So this can easily be done with the JavaScript file reader API. For that, I'll create a new constant, file reader, seems like a fitting name, and I instantiate a new file reader. Again, this is a vanilla JavaScript feature. The file reader allows me to convert this file. For this, I have to call, or I can call read as data URL, and I pass my file in there, so the first element in the files array. However, this will only trigger an event once it is done. It's an asynchronous action. So I have to set up an event listener, add event listener, and I have to listen to the load event, which is fired once it is done. In the callback here, I can now get access to the result of this operation, which can take a couple of milliseconds up to seconds. And here, I want to set this image URL equal to file reader result. And the interesting thing is, the result here is this base64 value, which is our image as text, you could say. Now, we use the image URL here on this image element in the source, and the source is able to handle base64 strings. So we will still get a preview with this approach, which is why I chose it. I want to make sure that the file picked by the user can be previewed, and that is easiest done by using such a base64 string. Now with that, we store the result of this file reader operation in the image URL property, which again, we use in the image element in our DOM. And with that, we're pretty much done here. One other thing I want to do is I want to store the raw file too. And for that, I'll add a new property, which I'll just name image, which is null initially. And whilst I do have the text representation, the base64 representation in the image URL, in the image I want to store the raw file, which is the file I'll later use once we submit the form. So I will say this image equal files 0. So simply store the file without any changes. Let's see if that works. Let's first of all compile this, and let's now pick an image here, like this one. Now that doesn't work. If we open the developer tools, we see an error, cannot reach property last index of undefined. The issue therefore is related to this line. However, it's really related to this line because I made a mistake here. It's not file name, it's just name. So with that in place, now it should work. If we now pick that image, we see the preview here. So that is working as intended. And with that, we can now continue filling this out and submit it, but we still won't upload the file because we haven't added any logic to do so. So this is the next step we have to do. Make sure that upon submitting the form, we actually store that file in Firebase. To upload that file, once we are done, we first of all have to change our onCreateMeetup method in the createMeetup component still. There, right now, we submit the image URL and we store that in Firebase. And that was nice at the time we just pasted the image URL into this text field, but with a real file, this won't work. Yes, this would now hold this base64 string, and yes, theoretically, we could store that in a database, because if we then fetch it again, it will work. But it's not optimal, because this string is obviously a very big string, and from a file size perspective, it can get really big. It's the whole image in a string in the end. So therefore, storing the image like this isn't that good. We shouldn't store that in the database. Instead, we should store the file as a binary file in the database. So to achieve this, what I'll do is I'll get rid of the image URL here and instead store image and refer to this image. Remember, this image really is just the image which I set up here and where I then ultimately save the file here. So this really is what I want to submit and what I want to store. Now, of course, you can even go ahead and add some validation here in onCreateMeetup and make sure that the file isn't null. So here we could check if this image, or check the opposite to be precise, if not this image, simply return. So submission will not be allowed if the image is still undefined or null as it is initially. Now with this basic validation in place, let's move over to the more interesting place, the create meetup action here in our Vuex store, because this is where we pass this data to. So let's head over to our store index.js file and let's work on that. There we get this create meetup method and we store the image URL like this at the moment. Now, of course, we can simply remove that because in the first action here, basically, where we push our new meetup onto the array of meetups in Firebase, there we don't want to pass that download URL too. Now what I want to do here is like a 3-step approach, because we have like a egg chicken problem. Do you say that, egg chicken? We say that in Germany. So whatever. What we have here is we want to store an image on Firebase and we want to make sure that it is connected to our meetup here. So we need the ID of the meetup. The ID of the meetup is created by Firebase though. So what I'll do is, first of all, I'll upload all the data I have to Firebase, to the database there, which gives me the ID. The ID is then returned here, this key we're already retrieving. I can then use this key to upload my image and associate it with that meetup. Then I'll get, hopefully, a success response. And in this final step, in the success response, I actually get the URL to the image where it was stored by Firebase. Then I reach out to the Firebase database again and update my meetup there to add this download URL to the Firebase object I have stored. So to the meetup object I have stored on Firebase, I should say. And then we're done. So step 1 is already implemented. We're storing this on Firebase. And let me quickly head over to Firebase. So here's our database. And we already have 2 meetups here. Now I'll get rid of these for now because we'll replace all of that anyways. And let's head over to storage. This is where I want to store my meetups. And this is basically the bucket where I want to put them. Now in the main.js file where we set our project up, there we have to add this storage bucket to the configuration. So it's simply this URL here. You just copy that, including the gs:// at the beginning, and enter it here. This is important so that the Firebase SDK is able to do that uploading for you. With that, let's head back and let's implement the actual uploading logic. So as I said, we already have the first step where we upload the meetups by pushing them onto this array, and then we get this key. Now, I won't commit my meetup at this point. I'll comment this out for now. Instead, I want to use this key to upload my image next. So I will simply return the key here to keep it really easy to keep track of everything. And I'll chain another then call here. Now in this then call here, I'll get the key because I returned it in the previous then call here. And here I now want to reach out to Firebase storage. First of all, I'll determine the file name. And I can get that from my payload, and there from the image, the name. Remember, payload has an image because we pass image as part of this object here. So image is part of the payload which reaches this action here. So we're retrieving the name of that image. Additionally, I want to know which extension it has. So I can retrieve the extension and store it by simply taking the file name and slicing it. And I want to slice it at the position of the last index of a dot. So this will basically give me the slice after the dot, which should be the extension. And with that, we got the extension. Now I want to store it in Firebase. So for that, we already import Firebase here. For that, I'll reach out to Firebase, but not to the database, but to the storage part of it instead. Just like with auth and with database, we get access to the storage related methods by executing storage as a method on the Firebase object. And then there, just like on the database, we get a reference to the path where we want to store it. And here, meetups make sense. However, I don't just want to store it on meetups. I want to store it on meetups and then connect it to the key we have here. So this basically will be the file name we save it at. So I want to store it at meetups and then slash plus key plus a dot plus the extension. So what this will do is it will store it in a meetup subfolder because of the slash. So that's a folder. And then the file name will be the key. So this random ID generated by Firebase dot the extension of the file so that we keep that extension on that file we store. And that is actually it. Now I will return this because it will return a promise so that we can chain another then call. Now here I will get some image information, I'll call it like this, or generally maybe file data. So some data about this file upload if it was successful, which it hopefully was. The important thing I can retrieve here is the image URL which I want to use. Now I want to use the image URL to reach out to Firebase and update the image there, the image URL there. Now to do this in an easy way, and because I'll need the image URL in another then block thereafter, I'll quickly create a variable before I start this whole promise chain, and I'll name it image URL. I'll also create one for the key, and I will therefore store the key in that key variable here. And I'll store the image URL here in this image URL variable by accessing file data. And then there we can get access to metadata and then download URLs. Whoops, download URLs. Now these could be multiple URLs if we had uploaded multiple files. We only uploaded one, so it's basically the first element in this array. This is the URL pointing to our file, and it is the URL we can paste into the browser to load our image. So I'm storing this. Now I want to return another Firebase call, this time to the database again, because as I said, now I want to update my element in the database with this download URL because I still want to store that in the database. So I'll reach out to my database and there ref to meetups, because that is where I stored my meetups, right? However, now I need to access my specific meetup, which I can do with child and then the key. That is why I stored it in a variable here, because I need it in this then block too. Key was created by Firebase, and it is the identifier of the element which was created in the first step of this promise chain, in this step here. So now I get access to that, and we can now conveniently call the update method to update this, which means it won't remove it, it won't overwrite it, it will only overwrite the fields we specify. We specify them in a JavaScript object, and here I specify the image URL field. And if that field doesn't exist yet, as it is the case here, it will simply create it. So here, image URL should have a value of image URL. So the image URL we fetched and saved in this variable. Now with that, let's add another then block here. Here we would get back some data, but I'm not interested in that. Instead, what I want to do here is I want to commit this to my local store. Because thus far, and I can remove it up there, thus far we only worked in Firebase. We stored the data, we uploaded the file, but we haven't reflected any of these changes in our local store, which I of course want to do. So here it's time to commit, create Meetup again. I want to take my old Meetup data, which I already have. So that is just the same code we used before. So use this Meetup here. However, this Meetup lacks the image URL. So I will add it here. I will add image URL, image URL. And we of course need this because we're retrieving it in our templates. We need that image URL. And this will be the image URL we got from Firebase, because we're referring to that image URL variable, which I'm setting here. Whew, so that was a lot. So with that, it's set. We're now having this hopefully stored in Firebase. And now let's simply try out if it works. If we head over and we organize a new meetup, we already are logged in still. So let's create a new meetup, the San Francisco meetup, because the image is from San Francisco, so the location should probably be there too. Let's pick that image. It will be awesome. And I won't bother changing this here. I'm more interested in if that works. So let me open the console to see any potential errors. Let's click create meetup. And we get an error, cannot read property download URLs of undefined. Now let's check our Firebase backend. The meetup was created here. We don't see the download URL because that clearly failed. Under storage, we also see no file there. So the file upload itself seemed to fail. That's why we don't have any download URLs probably. Now let's investigate why that happens. So after a short investigation, I made a nice discovery, and it's super hard to spot, but there is one thing I forgot when setting up this code. Do you spot it? Well, it never hurts to actually also send the file to the backend, right? I got my reference here when I reach out to storage, and I basically set up the where to store the file and how it should be named, but it would probably also be beneficial if I would specify the file I want to store. And we do this by chaining put. So just like on the database where we also set up a path and then we call update or push, well, for files we use put. And that always is a good idea to use if you want to get this file on the server. So put it is, and there of course we now simply pass the payload image, which is this raw image file, keep that in mind. So with that crucial change in place, let's go back and I'll quickly get rid of my entry here in the database first. Don't want to have that. So let's reload that. Should be gone. It is. So let's organize another meetup. Let's see if it now works. So the San Francisco meetup in San Francisco, where we upload the San Francisco image and type awesome here. Let's hit create meetup now. We don't see it here. Now it's there. Now the image loads. That seems to work. And obviously we saw it work. But if we check out Firebase here, we see the image URL. And under storage, we also see that we have this meetups folder where we have this file in there, keeping the file extension and having this cryptic name, which is the ID we got in the Firebase database. So With that, this is working. And obviously, if we click on it, we also see the image here. So now Firebase upload is working here. We are now able to upload images and not just pick URLs when creating new meetups. And I'd say this is a huge step forward. Now, in the next videos, I want to dive deeper into how we can actually change existing meetups, so add some edit functionality, and of course, finally implement a registration functionality. So we're nearing the end of the series, but we're not there yet. See you in the other videos. Bye.